So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 14th seminar in Iscia's Games and Play series. Uh, when we think about video games, we might first think about kind of entertainment and competition and storytelling and maybe just an escape from the world for a while. But games can also do something more philosophically interesting. They can place us inside a problem. So instead of just watching a character encountering a dilemma or something, we can or may have to make the decision ourselves, and then at least within the game world, kind of live with its consequences. So that difference between observing a choice and having to make it lies at the heart of today's presentation. Uh, Jade Claassen's wonderfully evocative title is Choices and Voices, Video Games as the Embodied Thought Experiment. So drawing on critical theory and phenomenology, Jade will explore how video games give players a sense of kind of bodily orientation and agency within digital worlds. Through like movement, decision making, feedback, players become these active participants who can intervene in those worlds and adapt to what happens and reflect on their own moral judgments. Okay, so these ideas are going to be developed through two particularly rich examples: Hellblade, Senua, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Senua's Sacrifice, and Detroit Become Human. Very evocative also. Both games immerse players in psychologically and ethically challenging situations, turning questions that might otherwise remain abstract into something much more immediate and experiential. Jade is currently a master's student in English literature at Nelson Mandela University. Her research focuses on representations of cognitive disability in contemporary media. And with an academic background in both English literature and psychology, as well as postgrad research on narrative strategies of video games, she's especially well placed to help us think about what games can do as stories, experiments, experiences, forms of thought. So, Jade, we're delighted to have you with us, and I'm very pleased now to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I'm just going to share my screen. Yeah. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. So yeah, as Andrea introduced, choices and voices, video games is the embodied thought experiment. I am Jade Claassen and I look forward to this seminar. Okay. So the seminar emphasizes video games as a unique medium distinct from literature and film, with leverage potential for not only communicating philosophical critiques, but directly getting audiences to engage as active agents in subjective experiences. In particular, the ability of the medium to allow players to experience complex moral and social dilemmas where they can not only experience agency, they can they can not only experience agency, choice, and consequence, but embody these experiences. This capacity for embodiment allows the medium to foment empathy and understanding through embodied virtual experiences, which places the player directly in the constructed reality of the game world. Detroit Become Human situates within complex moral scenarios in a dystopian world of clones and corporations, challenging the player with critical dilemmas representative of thought experiments from central philosophical works. Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice demonstrates the medium's significant capacity for phenomenological embodiment through the use of binaural audio, which is the production of 3D audio, and the environmental puzzles. Along with the directorial support from mental health professionals and their patients, Hellblade's approach establishes a circuit between the human and the machine, extending their body schema into the digital world and potentiating greater critical breakthroughs in thought, empathy, and understanding. Unlike literature and film, which invite cognitive and emotional engagement through representation, video games engage the body itself as a condition of participation. The player cannot remain an external observer because the game continuously demands participation. Spatial navigation, orientation, timing, rhythm, and movement become integral to meaning making. The player therefore does not simply understand the virtual world intellectually, but inhabits it through embodied action. Philosophical inquiry consequently becomes procedural rather than purely speculative. Ideas unfold not through detachment contemplation, but through cycles of action, consequences, reflection, and adaptation. In this sense, gameplay constitutes a uniquely interactive mode of philosophical thinking, in which understanding emerges through doing rather than merely knowing. So Detroit Become Human, the defining contribution of video games lies not simply in representing philosophical questions, but in translating them into lived experiences. Um, Ethical uncertainty, perceptual instability, and political responsibility merely to cease to exist merely as abstract concepts, and instead becomes conditions through which players must act. This distinction is significant because understanding emerges phenomenologically from experience itself, rather than solely through reflection upon representation. While phenomenology explains how players experience digital worlds through embodied perception, critical theory enables examination of the ideological, political, and ethical structures those worlds reproduce or challenge. Together, these perspectives allow video games to be understood not only as immersive technologies, but as sites of a philosophical critique. A central element used in exploring philosophical ideas is the concept of thought experiment, which generally features the use of imagery and narrative to frame a particular moral scenario or philosophical dilemma. A ship that is transformed piece by piece into two distinct vessels, the ship of Theseus, a donkey starving to death between two equal bales of hay and ass, numerous visions of a perfect utopian society, harrowing visions of life without any kind of an island, and yeah, an experience in which all desires will seem to be satisfied. Um, a society in which people are chosen by lottery to be killed for their organs. The list goes on. While these are thought experiments differ, while these thought experiments differ considerably in subject matter and philosophical orientation, they all rely on a common methodological principle. They ask the participant to imagine themselves within a hypothetical situation and to reason through its consequences. Whether considering justice through Plato's Ring of Gyges or personal identity through the ship of Theseus, the participant remains external to the scenario itself. The experiment unfolds primarily within imagination, requiring the reader to mentally simulate actions, consequences, and ethical judgments. The philosophical value, therefore, lies not in direct experience, but in reflective contemplation. Narrative media, such as literature and film, have historically expanded the expressive possibilities of these thought experiments by providing richer characters, settings, and emotional depth. Science fiction in particular has demonstrated remarkable success in translating philosophical inquiry into accessible cultural forms. Works such as Blade Runner 1982, The Matrix 1999, and Ex Machina 2014 invites audiences to reflect upon consciousness, artificial intelligence, freedom, and the nature of humanity through compelling narrative worlds. Yet, despite their philosophical sophistication, these media ultimately positions their audiences as observers, readers, and witness ethical dilemmas unfold through the experience of fictional characters, but they remain outside the decision-making process itself. Reflection occurs after the event has been narrated, rather than through direct participation within it. Video games fundamentally alter this relationship between the participant and philosophical problem. Rather than merely imagining a hypothetical scenario or observing another character's decisions, players actively perform philosophical choices through gameplay. Ethical dilemmas become inseparable from player agency, requiring decisions to be made under conditions of uncertainty, imperfect knowledge, and emotional investment. Consequently, philosophical reflection no longer emerges through contemplation, but through participation. The player is required to act before they can evaluate the consequences of those actions. This pressure is applied through quick time events where a player merely has a few seconds to make a decision. It is this participatory dimension that distinguishes video games from earlier forms of philosophical storytelling. Unlike literature and film, which communicate thought experiments through representation, games introduce what may be understood as an execution element. The procedural requirement that philosophical ideas must be enacted through player input. Every dialogue, choice, movement, interaction, or refusal to act contributes to the unfolding philosophical experiment. The player therefore becomes simultaneously observer, participant, and moral agent, transforming the traditional thought experiment into an embodied encounter in which ideas are not simply contemplated but lived through action. This execution element represents a significant evolution in the philosophical potential of narrative media. Rather than replacing traditional thought experiments, video games extend them into an experiential domain where agency, embodiment, and consequence becomes integral components of philosophical inquiry. The question is no longer simply, what would you do, but rather, what do you choose when confronted with the situation itself? It is this shift from imagination to enactment that positions video games as uniquely capable of functioning as embodied thought experiments. Through video games, such thought experiments can be readily experienced rather than represented through abstractions. This function gives the medium a unique status as it possesses the execution element, which is absent from most philosophical discussions. Rather than the audience being a passive observer, they are an active agent, directing the flow of narrative through their actions. In the gaming history, this mechanic is known as an interactive or branching narrative. For Quantic Dream, the developers behind Detroit Become Human, these types of games are their speciality. All their previous games experimented with philosophical and psychological themes. However, they were contained mostly to the level of the individual. Heavy Rain and Beyond Two Souls explored morality from parental sacrifice to metaphysical identities. Detroit Become Human escalates this to the societal level, both in the scale of the scenario as well as the scale of player agency. For context, Detroit Become Human situates the player within a world where artificially intelligent robots known as androids, have been developed to take over a lot of the human laboring works. The humans in the game can purchase a domestic cleaning drone, a carer for an elderly or weakly. They are programmed to be construction workers and even used in strip clubs. The video game follows three narratives. The first is a domesticated android, Kara, who runs away with a little girl because her owner is abusive. There is Marcus, who is a carer for an elderly, and when the son of the owner gets jealous, a series of unfortunate events leads to Marcus being discarded on a landfill site. What happens to the owner depends on the player's choice and reaction times. The third narrative follows Connor, who hunts deviant androids. So androids like Kara and Marcus, who have gone against their programming. and essentially gain a conscience. How these narratives play out all depends on the player's decisions in the games, as well as reactions or hesitations. The player has to decide whether the androids are ethically worth saving. Detroit expanded into collective ethics and political philosophy, situated around revolutions, rights, justice, and recognition. For example, Marcus's uprising forces the player to choose between a peaceful resistance or a violent revolution. Because the game's social and political systems respond to these decisions, the player experiences the tension between moral principle and political effectiveness rather than simply reading about it. Unlike watching a character decide whether to sacrifice one life to save many, a game can require the player to make the decision personally, knowing that the narrative will permanently change according to their choice. This distinction may appear subtle, yet it represents a significant shift in how philosophical inquiry can be conducted through narrative media. In literature, readers may disagree with a character's decision while remaining detached from their consequences. Likewise, film viewers may sympathize with or criticize the actions of the protagonist without bearing responsibility for them. Interactive digital media collapses this distinction between observer and actor. By requiring the player input, games transform philosophical scenarios into procedural experiences whose outcomes depend upon the player's decisions. Moral responsibility consequently shifts from the fictional character to the embodied participant operating through the avatar. In the opening scene of the game, the hostage sequence, the player must negotiate with the domesticated android Daniel while balancing empathy, deception, and risk. The outcome depends on the player's own decisions, transforming a classical moral dilemma into an enacted experience of responsibility. The player's relationship with the avatar is therefore unlike that found in other narrative forms. Rather than functioning simply as a protagonist whose actions are observed, the avatar becomes an extension of player intentionality. Through repeated interactions with controllers, keyboards, or other interfaces, the player's body gradually incorporates these technologies into its own motor repertoire. Drawing upon Maurice Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, this process may be understood through the notion of the body schema, whereby tools cease to be experienced as external objects and instead become integrated into bodily perception and action. Just as a blind person's cane becomes an extension of touch rather than an object held in the hand, the game controller gradually disappears from conscious awareness as the player intention is projected directly into the virtual world. This embodied relationship enables the phenomenological dimension of the execution element. Decisions made within the game world are not merely selected from a menu of abstract possibilities. They are enacted through bodily engagement within the digital space. Importantly, this execution element is not reducible to interactivity alone. Many digital systems require user interaction without inviting philosophical reflection. What distinguishes narrative video games is the integration of meaningful agency with ethical, political, or existential consequence. In this sense, gameplay functions as a procedural thought experiment in which philosophical ideas are continuously tested through cycles of action, consequence, reflection, and adaptation. The world responds to the player's decisions. The player adjusts subsequent behavior in response to those outcomes, and the philosophical understanding emerges through the iterative feedback loop. Detroit Become Human further situates the player within systematic structures: law enforcement, protest, revolution, media perception. Um, Back to the hostage scene between Connor and Daniel, this echoes Philippa Foot's famous trolley problem: sacrifice one or many to save another. Marcus's revolution, violent or peaceful, reflects the utilitarian calculus of Jeremy Bentham. and John Stuart Mill, is violence justified if it secures freedom for many? Androids becoming deviant recalls Plato's allegory of the cave from Book 7 of the Republic, an awakening from illusion to truth. Connor's potential self-awareness mirrors Descartes' I think, therefore I am, raising the question of androids' consciousness. The public perception of androids, machines versus persons, mirrors Kantian's ethics to treat beings as ends, not means. Androids treated as disposable labor reflects Foucault's discipline and punish through the production of docile bodies. The mass extermination scenarios produced in the game mirrors Achebe's Mbembe's necropolitics, sovereign power by virtue of being human as the right to decide who may live and who may die. This makes the player agent complicit in shaping the collective future of all society, ultimately making Detroit a more direct philosophical laboratory, allowing the player to embody experience and consequence through the game's central three characters and their 85 different endings. Traditional philosophy frequently separates thinking from acting, asking participants to reason about hypothetical situations from a position of reflective distance. The execution element collapses this distinction by making action the very condition through which philosophical understanding emerges. Decisions must be enacted before they can be evaluated, while consequences are experienced before they are reflected upon. While Detroit Become Human demonstrates the ethical dimensions of the execution element, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice explores its phenomenological potential. If Detroit asks the player to make moral decisions concerning artificial life and political justice, Hellblade asks a different philosophical question altogether. What does it feel like to perceive the world through an altered consciousness? Rather than constructing ethical dilemmas through branching narratives, Hellblade transforms perception into the site of philosophical inquiry. Detroit Become Human and Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice both exemplify the embodied screen by collapsing the boundary between player, avatar, and interface. Rather than a lens to view the game world, the screen becomes an extension of the player's perception. Detroit Become Human's branching narrative requires players to inhabit androids, negotiating autonomy, morality, and recognition. In such a game, the player embodies their choices and the consequences of those choices. To put Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice into context, this is a game that does not depend on the player's choices. It is a linear narrative. The narrative follows a woman, Senua, in the 8th century in the Orkney Islands of Scotland. Senua suffers from psychosis and experiences schizophrenic-like symptoms such as multiple voices speaking in her head, shouting, communicating. She finds patterns in the environment and needing to make sense of them. Senua's father shunned her for this as he believed she was cursed. Senua falls in love with a man who sees past to psychosis. And skipping a few details, her village gets raided by Vikings, and her lover Dillian is hanged in a spread eagle position as a sacrifice to the Vikings' gods. Senua promises to save Dillian's soul from Hela, the goddess of Helheim. Warning, spoilers alert, if you want to play this game, still block your ears for a minute. Senua's journey to save Dillian turns out to not be possible, as she transcends her journey to Helheim, fighting monsters that could be representing her inner demons. Facing her past traumas and memories could all build up and lead to the conclusion of the final boss scene with Hela. As the player fights the waves of enemies that Hela sends forth, the voices tell her to give up, but the player and Senua ignores these voices and continues to fight these monsters. The only way to win is to give up. And this is Senua's journey of realizing that she cannot bring her loved one back, and that she cannot change her psychosis. She has to accept it and stop fighting. Now, with that, the game recommends that you use headphones for the immersion. Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice uses binaural and visual distortions to simulate psychosis as a lived phenomenological reality. Senua's hallucinations and fragmented perception are not narrated from outside, but experienced through the player's embodied interface with the game. The avatar is no longer a separate entity that the player controls, but they are extensions of the player themselves. The hallucinations and distortions Senua experiences destabilizes the player's motor actions, the combat, the navigation, producing a feedback circuit between body and technology that exemplifies Merleau-Ponty's notion of the flesh, intertwining the sensing and the sense. Merleau-Ponty distinguishes between reflective intention and what he terms motor intentionality, the body's pre-reflective capacity to orientate itself towards meaningful actions without conscious deliberation. Everyday activities such as walking, catching a ball, or driving a familiar route, rarely explicit calculation. Instead, the body responds directly to the demands of its environments. To quote Merleau-Ponty, once the stick has become a familiar instrument, the world of feeble things recedes and now begins not at the outer skin of the hand, but at the end of the stick. The stick is no longer an object perceived by a blind man, but an instrument with which he perceives. It is a bodily auxiliary, an extension of the bodily synthesis. Video games extend this process into digital space. Through repeated interaction, controller inputs cease to be continuously processed button presses and instead becomes immediate expressions of the player's intentionality. The avatar therefore functions not simply as a fictional character, but as the extension of the player's embodied orientation towards the virtual world. Cybernetic feedback loops used by the game designers to either discourage or reinforce player behaviors foster a sense of habit around controller movements and in-game consequences of quick time events or dialogues. This reinforcement projects motor intentionality into the game world, where through habit, repetition, and consequence, movement is no longer considered calculated effort, but an instinctive response of the body schema reacting to events in the games. As Merleau-Ponty illustrates through the example of the blind man's cane, a tool that is repeatedly used ceases to be experienced as an external object and instead becomes incorporated into perception itself. The player-controller relationships operate similarly. With sufficient familiarity, the controller no longer feels like an intermediary between player and game. Rather, it becomes an extension of the player's embodied engagement within the virtual world. Actions performed through the controller are experienced as immediate intentions directed towards the avatar rather than a discrete mechanical input. For example, multiple voices whisper, argue, warn, and mock Senua through binaural audio. Voices appear to come from different directions to the player. Perception itself becomes unstable. The binaural voices surrounding Senua does not merely describe hallucinations. They spatially envelope the player, creating the sensation that thoughts and warnings are occurring around the body rather than on a screen. This is if you use headphones. The player must physically move through the environment to align shapes and symbols. Meaning emerges through bodily movement. Perception and navigation become intertwined. The environment appears unstable and ambiguous. The ruined puzzles require the player to move through space until fragmented visual forms suddenly align in meaningful symbols, making perception itself an embodied act of discovery. Senua's psychosis provokes her journey, her visions guide her, and embracing distortions enables her to unlock her path and her power. Embodying Senua through her journey uses these unique immersive features of the medium to build empathy, for the subjective experiences of mental health conditions like psychosis, particularly as the schizoanalytical representation of her journey demonstrates the positive and productive potential of her being. The empathy generated by Hellblade differs fundamentally from that produced by conventional narrative media. Literature and film frequently encourage an audience to sympathize with characters through observation and emotional identification. Hellblade instead produces empathy through embodied simulation. The player experiences uncertainty, sensory overload, hesitation, and perceptual instability as conditions of gameplay rather than merely as narrative description. The philosophical significance of this design lies in demonstrating that understanding another consciousness may arise through embodied participation rather than detached representation. Although both games investigate profoundly different philosophical questions, they demonstrate the same underlying principle. Detroit Become Human externalizes philosophy through ethical action, requiring players to negotiate justice, autonomy, and political responsibility through consequential decision making. Hellblade Senua Sacrifices internalizes philosophy through altered perception, requiring players to inhabit a world structured by uncertainty, hallucination, and fragmented consciousness. Together, these games reveal that philosophical significance of video games lies not in the subject that they depict, but in the medium's capacity to transform abstract questions into embodied experiences. Through the execution element, ethical dilemmas and phenomenological conditions cease to be objects of detached contemplation and instead become lived encounters enacted through player participation. Detroit Become Human and Hellblade Senua's Sacrifice therefore demonstrate two complementary dimensions of the execution element. Detroit foregrounds ethical embodiment, requiring players to make a political and moral decision whose consequences reshape an entire society. Hellblade foregrounds phenomenological embodiment, immersing players within a destabilized field of perception that must be navigated bodily and emotionally. In both cases, philosophical questions are not simply represented through narrative, but enacted through player participation. Video games are still regarded with a degree of bias in terms of their ability to serve as serious, critical, and contemplative media. Games like Detroit and Hellblade bear the potential to be the boundary expanding works, expanding the medium to new possibilities. Other cultural products like film and comic books also experienced such a transition from initially being seen as forms of spectacle and mass entertainment, or pulp fiction for young children, or being recognized as media with critical philosophical potential. In the years since, we have seen a broad range of filmmakers use film and entertainment as vehicles for critical discourse. Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, as I mentioned earlier, Cameron's Terminator 1984, Spielberg's Jurassic Park 1993, the Charlie Brooker's Black Mirror series that takes through different scenarios. Video games should therefore not be merely understood as another medium capable of representing philosophical ideas. Their significance lies in their ability to transform philosophy from speculative reflection into embodied participation. Through the execution element, thought experiments become procedural experiences in which understanding emerges through action, consequence, and adaptation. Detroit and Hellblade demonstrate. Additionally, modern audiences are showing a different stance towards media as well as different energy towards social and activist causes. As the industry looks towards new markets and attempts to track the direction of the video games, developing games with critical and emancipatory themes may succeed among these audiences. While Detroit asks the ethical question, what ought I to do? Hellblade poses the phenomenological question, what is it like to experience the world differently? Together, they demonstrate that the embodied thought experiments may operate through both moral action and perceptual transformation. Literature asks us to imagine, cinema asks us to observe, and video games asks us to decide. Thank you.
Jade, thank you. Whew. Um, that is a lot to take in, but wow. Okay. So would you mind unsharing your screen and then we'll
Yes.
we'll start engaging so if there are people who would like, I see lots of claps going up the screen, lots of thumbs up. So if anyone would like to engage with Jade, just stick your hand up, or if you can't stick your hand up, then somehow, draw attention to yourself. I see Jenna's hand is up. Jenna, let's start with you.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Jade, for a fantastic presentation. I have a couple of questions for you, and they all have to do with intentionality. So, the first question I want to ask is you describe the execution element as what separates active participation from passive observation. So, I want to ask does this participation constitute a genuine extension of the player's own intentionality, or is it better understood as a simulated intentionality that the player merely inhabits temporarily? And then, related to that, does the act of making choices in Detroit, for example, necessarily constitute ethical deliberation? Or might it sometimes be better understood as a form of narrative optimization in which players seek preferred outcomes rather than confront moral complexity? And then, piggybacking off that, how do you theorize the tension between player intentionality and designer intentionality? Because when the player makes an apparently ethical choice, like to what extent is that judgment genuinely the player's? And then to what extent has it already been structured by the game's narrative or mechanics or available outcomes?
Okay. So I'm going to probably need you to repeat one or two of those. The first one, I think it is more simulated intentionality. Because you are still limited to the options and the choices you make. I think this would answer maybe half of the other question as well. You are limited to what the designers have designed. But that's what makes Detroit more unique, compared to other video games that have attempted to do this choice based game, where you can easily be given four options, and it comes down to, do you think the player themselves have to decide if they're going to play as if these androids are living beings, or if you see them as androids. And that's where empathy also comes in, and the choices they make is just it's what they think is ethically correct or not. It might be a little guided by the game designs, but ultimately there are decisions to completely distance yourself from these androids, especially in Connor's perspective. And that's why there's also 85 endings to accommodate for each and every person's type of way of playing and thinking and their morals and dilemmas. And then if I'm missing a question, please repeat.
I think that covers everything. Um, yes, that covers all my questions. See, they were all related to intentionality.
Yes.
I could have simplified it into one question, I suppose, but as you present, then different questions come into my mind, and I make notes, and then when you ask to ask questions, then I'm trying to remember everything that I've jotted down, and my handwriting is atrocious. But brilliant. Thanks so much, Jade.
Oh, thank you for the questions.
Okay. Thanks, Jenna. Um, I see Gary has his hand up, but I'm going to just jump in there. Take advantage of the fact that I have a voice now, because I have very similar concerns to Jenna. And I thought your metaphor of Merleau-Ponty's stick was really interesting because, in a certain sense, that stick is a one-way extension of the holders, the person who holds the stick, of it's an extension of that person's intentionality, and in a certain sense, it kind of extends that person's body and makes the touch just well, it's like a prosthetic that makes something more possible. Um, but the video games as that kind of instrument are not one way, are they? Because you've got
No.
all of that stuff coming in, invading into you from whoever designed that game. And that to me is flippin' terrifying. It's like, who is making these games? What is their agenda? And if I open myself up to this, I'm giving them a window into my very being. Um, and I know this is part of the whole fear and about media and about AI and all of that. So it was just something I wanted to comment on. It's not a question it's not really a question. It was just that I don't know if Jenna and I are showing, a different generation age thing, but there's something to my mind very terrifying about that. Um,
Yeah. To comment on that, it's if I go blind today and I use a cane, it will take a bit of getting used to. But over time and use, it becomes one. It becomes a sensory organ. The same is applied to the controllers, or even the voices in Senua's head. Some people give up in the first few minutes because the voices can be so overwhelming with the headsets coming from all directions, different voices, soft voices, angry voices. But with the controller, if you miss your quick time event, which will say jump, if you miss that, your player trips and it affects the consequence of that action. The deviant android gets away. Now, some people who want the androids to live will intentionally miss those quick time events. They will decide not to. So they become aware of the controller and which buttons to press and which one is the interaction and which one is the dialogue choice. So yeah, it can be quite scary. You are offering yourself to the game on there's stats on people's decisions, and most people choose to save the androids.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, thanks so much, Jade. We'll open the floor to Gary first and then to Erin.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jade. Very interesting games. I haven't played those, but I used to play the open world sort of first person shooter stuff, which allowed you to do a lot of you could move around as you wish and make
Yes.
choices. They had consequences. The one thing that interests me, well, there's two things that interest me. The one is, well, there is one thing that interests, and there's a question, is that you would expect with the amount of violence in video games and that it transcends into people's lives, and you see more violent gamers and that type of thing. But you don't see that. You don't see a more violent world as a consequence, and I'm wondering why that is. And it goes to the second possibly observation is that. I mean, the point that you're making is that video games allow a more realistic embodiment in terms of your choices. It's a kind of where pilots can learn to train to fly. It's a simulator without the consequence of actually dying because you crash the plane. But isn't philosophy grounded in the ultimate risk of death, of that there's a real consequence to your actions? And does video gaming allow you to get there?
So when it comes to violence being depicted in video games, that is more down to games that aren't narrative based. It is more the uh, load into a game, shoot, die, load back in, repeat, killing other players. But I think it's not as big. I think it is a stereotype. I mean, there are studies, and I'm sure some studies do advocate for it, for the isolated beings that are within their game worlds, their violent games. But the same can be said for the normal films, like American Psycho and all those violent movies that are instilled into people. And some people take that and could also be like, okay, well, I want to be like this guy because it's been represented in a cool way. But it isn't really. It all comes down to also controlling who can see it. So if a child is exposed to it from a very young age, I can imagine that they would be more likely to be a violent person. But this is more like psychology. So that's why there's games are rated. That's why movies are rated. And if the parents control what the children can play and watch, that hopefully controls the potential violent outcomes of the future that can happen. I'm not sure if that answers your question though.
No, so the point is that you're not seeing that, is that you're not seeing the violence in real life as an outcome of violence in the digital world, you know.
Mm,
So I mean the logical argument is that you're what is the term? Is that you're sanitizing the consequence of using violence, you know, and
mm,
so that in the real world you then that people are not as the consequence of it is not as you're not as attuned to it. So I'm
yeah,
interested why you're not seeing that increase, you know. So
yeah,
like if you look at the school shooting in America and that kind of stuff, it's an American phenomenon. It's not really a global phenomenon, but
mm,
gaming is global, you know.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so
But
I'm interested in, yeah.
but that leads it to also, isn't the American gun laws a little less strict than the global gun laws? Or the accessibility, the control of those firearms are, I guess, more easily accessible, which allows for radical ideas.
If I may
And
jump in.
spread media of
Oh,
that. Sorry.
no, no, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
If I also may jump in on your point, Gary, though I think video games do offer more of an immersive experience than other forms of literature, if that's how we're referring to it, you also, and you might become quite, yeah, immersed in the experience, you don't forget that you are interacting with a fictional narrative. You know, I mean, you could also be reading a book about pirates, and become so immersed in the story that, I mean, you forget that you're looking at text on a page and your imagination goes wild and it can also be immersive in its own way. But you're going to step out of that world when you close the book and you're not going to go and think like, oh, I'm going to go get my pistol and blow up some people. It's, yeah, I don't know if that maybe contributes to your point at all of the lack of increased violence as a consequence of video gaming. But yeah, just a 2 cents.
Awesome, thanks. Thanks, Aaron.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Also, something just before we go back to you, Erin, something I think is interesting there is that on the one hand, Erin, you've just said, well, there really are no real consequences for your choices. It's just a game, and you know you're playing just a game. And on the other hand, Jade, in a certain sense, is saying, well, you're doing ethical training in a way, and that you make choices and you feel those consequences or you bear those consequences, but it is only in the game world. So I don't know. There's something interesting about that. I think that the consequences for your choices are actually only really in the game. So I wonder how much of that ethical training you do have, because you could just play the game and you could play in that game and you could pretend to be a person who dislikes androids and wants to kill them. You know what I mean? It's just you can be anything in that game. So the consequences are not there. There are no consequences. You just turn off the game halfway if you don't like what's happening. Not like life.
Could I jump in response to that again? Sorry,
Yes,
Jade, I don't want
and
to
then
hijack your
sorry about that,
seminar.
but then we
Please
need
go for
to
it.
go to Adrian and then Norma after that. Yes, thanks, Erin.
Sure. So this does kind of also connect with the question I was going to ask Jade. But there are some consequences in the fact of you feel really bad. So I got completely stuck into a game called Baldur's Gate 3 was it a few years ago now, last year at some point. Anyway, um and it's a game where you can play a lot of different ways. You can play as the good guy or you can play as the bad guy. And I of course did the good guy playthrough first. Um and then I tried to do the bad guy playthrough, and I still haven't finished it because I can only play for like a short amount of time. And then I feel awful, absolutely terrible, because
Mm.
you are consciously aware that you are doing the evil things in the game. And yes, it doesn't have consequences in real life, um, but it very much is a feeling of being aware that, oh, this is a bad thing. And yes, I'm performing it. Um, but yeah, there's this sort of dual thing of like, okay, I'm playing this character and it's the character who's evil and making the evil choices. But also me as the person who's separate from this feels really icky that I'm making these bad choices and oh, I want to very much distance myself from the little avatar that's going around on the screen doing bad things. Um and also to that, the question that I wanted to ask to you, Jade, sorry, in case Andrea, you didn't want to say any more,
No, 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 no.
was
Thank you. Yeah.
yeah, about the ending of Hellblade. And again, spoilers to anyone. But as you talked about in your seminar, uh, instead of actually winning, which typically when you go into a game, there's this expectation that, oh, you can do, if you do it perfectly, you're going to win. But in Hellblade, you actually have to lose because Senua has to give up in the narrative. And so the game actually forces the player to just give up. And in that, there's almost like uh, that separation between the character on screen and the person who's playing almost becomes less, I think, in my perspective. So I don't know if you want to speak a little bit more to that. Yeah, and if there's anything you want to add.
Yeah, so I'm very passionate about the ending of Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. The entire game destabilizes the player in that it's not a traditional game. You don't win at the end, but the player has in its mind that you're going to win. And in one of my slides, there are instructions saying that if the dark rot, each time you die, the dark rot grows. And by the time the dark rot is fully grown, you start over, everything is wiped. Now, that is a bluff. That isn't a game rule. So you are essentially bluffed and you are more careful with how you play the game, so you don't die and your progress gets lost. So I think the design of this game is just generally to destabilize the player. The philosophical breakthrough happens precisely when the player's mechanical desire to win collapses, which aligns the player behavior directly with Senua's psychological acceptance. So you kind of have to just give up. You have to listen to the voices, or you fight, and then you realize by the time all the enemies overwhelm you that, oh, this was meant to happen, and that you can't win the game, and she cannot save her lover. It's very sad. Yeah.
Adrian?
Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for a wonderful presentation, Jade. I have one question for you, but I also have a comment on the idea that ethical scenarios need to have real world consequences. I don't think it's a problem at all that the game doesn't have real world consequences. I think the power in thought experiments is that they don't have real world consequences, so you can experiment with them. So all the philosophical thought experiments, the trolley problem, parfits, teletransporters, the uncomfortable consequences of Kant's categorical imperative. The power in them is that you can experiment with them. You can say, okay, well, if I did this, it would lead to that. If I did that, it would lead to that. And obviously, if you had real world consequences, you couldn't do that. So I think the fact that these are embedded in a game is, as powerful as, the experiments in text or whatever. And then I wanted to ask you, Jade, do you think that these sorts of the participatory or active thought experiments that we can engage with in games, do you think they change the nature of the thought experiments, or is it just that they're more easily accessible? Is there something more going on there now that we are phenomenologically engaged with them, or is it just an ease of access type of thing?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you for your question. I'm also trying to apply that to like the real world because today we are fearing that AI is going to take over and the robots will take our jobs and they will have a conscience. So I think games like these that play out the thought experiments and allows the player to decide these things, it allows them to also have a slower reaction to if something like that does occur. So we're not immediately going to put our walls up. We will be like, okay, wait, we were prepared for this. We planned this. And they'll slow down their thoughts and not make rash decisions. It's a thought experiment. I'm saying that now, but flight or fight mode will kick in and it will be completely out the window. I'll forget about the thought experiment. But it's hard to determine. I think it's all just, yeah, I'm not sure. I think I might have skipped over your question and just went to my thoughts. Okay, thank you for your question.
Great, thanks, Jade. And thanks, Adrian, for that answer about thought experiments. I thought that was very insightful. Norma.
Yes. Thank you. Hi, Jade.
Hi,
Yeah.
Norma.
What you discussed for me, it's like a new phenomenon. But what caught my attention was when you mentioned Plato's cave and Descartes' android. Now,
Yeah.
while I was listening to you, my thought was, so while we are playing the video game, who becomes the cave and who becomes the android or demon in that case? Then should you tell me who the role players are there? My question then is, so if that is the case, shouldn't we then say that while I'm playing the video game, like the one that you were showing, and my avatar is bleeds or is cut by something, does my wincing have anything to do with the thought patterns of these two? How then in the thought process do we reconcile the effectiveness or lack thereof of the influence of a video game?
Okay, thank you for your question.
If I'm
I
making
think
sense.
in the moment, um, if your android gets cut and you flinch, it also you kind of determine whether or not you're going to react to that cut emotionally or angrily. So that is also still like asking you how would you react, and that will come with a natural instinct from playing the game. So you'll naturally decide, oh, ow, that hurts. And if you're an emotional person, you'll be like confronting them about it. If you don't want conflict, you won't be angry and attack back. That also goes back to Erin, the Baldur's Gate game where she's trying to play the bad guy, but she cannot because the making bad decisions or making something that goes against your own ethics and your own moral dilemmas, it doesn't come naturally, so you're not naturally going to enact that way. And when it comes to the cave, essentially, um, the people in the cave are facing the wall and they just see the shadows walk past. So they have no insight on what's behind them. They're confined to the cave and they're seeing. And when they finally see the outside, that's essentially can be linked to androids gaining consciousness. They didn't know any better in their programming. Um, but now this also comes to how we are applying our thoughts. Do these androids develop consciousness? So the cave allegory really comes down to how we interpret it. Do these androids turn around and say, "Oh wow, there's a world out there. That's the evil world. We're used to the shadows, you know." But I'm not sure if that answers your question.
But
Yeah,
thanks anyway.
it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Norma. And Jade, we are out of time.
Oh, right on
Whew,
time.
that went fast.
Yeah, it really did.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and I'm sure that there's still oh, I can see all sorts of claps zooming up my screen. That was a wonderful presentation. And yes, it'll be ready on YouTube, and I'm sure that it's going to inspire all sorts of additional questions and thoughts and yeah, reflections. So thank you very much for a very stimulating, exciting talk. And I think we're going to have an equally interesting talk next week by Ansel Loubser. And the title is The Serious Man and the Mushroom, Mycelial Ethics of Care, which should be very interesting too. So thank you so much. And goodbye, everybody, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.